So my name is Luke Sibieta. I'm a research fellow at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and I lead IFS's work on education spending, which is kindly and generously supported by the Nuffield Foundation. And I'm going to be talking about some of the spending and funding pressures on special educational needs in England, which have been become increasingly pressing over time. And I should say at the start, this is a very high level and summary presentation. Underneath every bullet point and every graph, there is an incredibly high level of nuance and complexity. And we can pick that up in further discussion as well. So the kind of overall background and intro, we're very familiar. There's been a very large rise in the numbers of pupils with education, health and care plans in England. We've seen a really rapid rise in both spending and in funding. But despite the rapid rise in spending, to quote Luke, everyone is unhappy with the system. No one is particularly happy with the way the system works in England. Everyone agrees it needs to be reformed and changed, but people disagree in terms of how it should be changed. And that's what that's the problem at the moment. In our view and the assessment of the way the system works at the moment in England, we think that insufficient attention has been paid to supply side capacity in the system. And by supply side, I mean the numbers of staff, the numbers of specialist staff, the number of teachers with good training, the number of TAs with high levels of training. There's been a big focus on the demand side and an insufficient focus on the supply side and having a workforce that can deliver support on a large scale. As you know, the government is planning some major reforms to the system, and that will involve extra spending, and that's going to have a more focus on providing more upstream and mainstream support in a flexible way, which all sounds very nice, but is obviously a very difficult and complex thing to do and to get right. Fortunately, the government has about 3 years to try and consult and get it right, which I think is a good thing, because I think trying to put it in a system next year would be almost impossible. Having a bit of time to think through the way to do it, I think, is desirable. So just to illustrate the really rapid rises in funding and spending over time, the blue bars here show the level of funding for special educational needs in England over time, which has risen from around 8 billion to around 12 billion in the latest year of data in 2025-2026. Spending has risen even faster, from around 8 billion in 2015 to around 15 billion pounds today. And that's been driven by the fact that needs identified through EHCPs have risen faster than overall funding levels have. And as a result, there's been a gap between funding and spending, and councils have year on year been building up deficits, which have amounted to around £5 billion today, which have been largely written off as of last month. So that puts councils in a slightly better position than they were. That doesn't remove a lot of the pressures going forwards, because if we look at the forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility, they forecast last year funding levels being approximately constant in real terms through 28-29, and spending continuing to rise to around £18 billion in 28-29, which would mean a gap in spending and funding around £6 billion. And that's, from a financial perspective, is a worrying thing, but it's probably underlying even more problems in the system. But when there's such a huge gap between funding and spending, you're going to be talking about much more conflict, much more difficult to in terms of using resources and who gets what. So underneath that £6 billion is a lot more pressure than even is in the system at the moment. If we think, so I've already said that we've seen a really big rise in numbers of pupils with EHCPs, and just to illustrate this point, with a line going up quite sharply over time. So up to around 2018, the share of pupils with EHCPs, or the forerunner special educational needs statement, was constant at around 2.8% precisely. The number of pupils with certain statements for around 20 years, and that was almost by design in the system, which is probably not a great thing in and of itself, but that's the way it was. And then from 2018, we've seen a really rapid rise in the number of pupils with the EHCP, which has approximately doubled over the last 8 years. And according to our projections and those from the government, that will continue to rise to around 8% by 28-29. And there have been particular needs identified in the system that have driven this rise over time, and particularly pupils with needs related to autistic spectrum disorder, speech, language and communication needs, social, emotional, mental health needs, which in this case includes ADHD. Those have been the 3 primary needs that have been associated with a rise in EHCPs over time. We can also look at the types of spending have driven the increases in spending over time. And most spending on special educational needs goes through special schools. Around 2/3 to 70% of spending on special educational needs happens through special schools. And that's been the primary driver of increases in spending over time. We've seen high needs place funding rise by around £1 billion. So that's funding for just core funding for places in special schools. Top-up funding within special schools for particular pupils has risen by around a further £1 billion. And we've also seen really rapid rises in spending on independent special schools. And that's largely because state special schools have been full and there have been capacity constraints, and therefore councils have sought out places at relatively expensive, well, very expensive independent special schools. But we also do see big rises in funding within mainstream schools as well, as more pupils are in mainstream schools have EHCPs too. And beyond place funding and resources, we've seen really rapid rises in spending on special educational needs transport, which has risen from about £1 billion to £2 billion by 2025, has been rising even faster in the last 2 years. And that's largely reflecting the increases in numbers of pupils in special schools and the fact that pupils need to be driven further across the country. And to illustrate the rise in special schools, I've taken a graph from the government's consultation paper, and I don't really like this graph, but it also it makes an important point. The reason I don't like it is because it compresses the y-axis to be between 1% and 2%, which I think is a little bit narrow. However, it does make an important point about the quite rapid proportionate rise in the share of pupils in special schools. Between the mid-1980s and the late 2000s, there was a fall in the share of pupils in England in special schools from around 1.5% to around 1.1%. That's now risen to about 1.9% of pupils in England, and continues to rise. And there are also huge differences across the UK in the share of pupils who are in special schools. In Northern Ireland, it's very similar to England, with around 2% of pupils in special schools. In Wales, it's lower at 1.4%. In Scotland, it's lower still at 1.1%. And I make this point not because I think any of these countries are getting them right. Well, hopefully someone's getting it right. But I don't think it's obvious who's getting it right. And I think that's kind of the problem with the way the decisions are made in the system at the moment. We don't know in a lot of cases whether pupils would have been better off in from a sort of very stand-back educational point of view, would have been better off in special schools or in mainstream schools. We haven't got good evidence to make those judgments at the moment, which is difficult given we know that's the big driver of spending. So if we look at outcomes in the system, we've already Luke's already mentioned about how everyone is unhappy with the system, and that can be seen in so many metrics, and I've just picked out a few here. High wait times for HCPs, the variability across the country, the increasing wait times across the country, and obviously everyone's very familiar with the high level of confrontation and tribunals and litigation that happens within the English system, which is a peculiarly English way of managing the system. If we look, even within the UK, we see really big differences. So within England in 23-24, there are around 21,000 SEND tribunals, or around 23 per 10,000 pupils. In Wales, there were 130, or around 3 per 10,000 pupils. That's huge differences in the way the system operates and the way the system decides how to allocate resources. I'm a peculiar person. I've read some of the annual reports of the additional needs tribunals in Wales. And one of the things they were asking for is they wanted more appeals. They wanted more tribunals, particularly with regards to looked after children, because they thought it was important that they set precedents and make decisions. Contrasting that with what happens in England is just, it's a totally different system. We also know that the quality of what's offered within, what's actually offered as a result of EHCP varies considerably by school and across the country. And we can also look in more detail at how outcomes vary for pupils with special educational needs. Sort of unsurprisingly, they tend to be lower than average outcomes, but it kind of raises some points about what the system is trying to achieve. So if we look at purely academic outcomes, these are standardized GCSE scores where the average is always 0 over time. Pupils without special educational needs tend to achieve higher on average, and pupils with educational health care plans tend to have lower outcomes on average. That hasn't changed that much over time, and to see a gap like that isn't terribly surprising. What is really important and interesting is the variation. And I think that is really important in terms of thinking about the system, how to design the system, and not having a one-size-fits-all system. So pupils with autistic spectrum disorder, speech and language communication needs, other special needs tend to achieve higher GCSE results than children with moderate and severe learning difficulties. That almost kind of fits very much with your priors. But as I said, it's just important to emphasise that a one-size-fits-all system does not make sense. Pupils have very, very different needs, and a system needs to be able to respond to those very different needs. And we also see beyond the educational system, pupils who have had EHCPs or SEND statements are much more likely to be on disability benefits. They're more likely to be out of work. They're more likely to be in not employment, education and training. And the differences with pupils without special needs are really, really quite substantial. And what we obviously don't know is what would have happened without support. Those differences could have been even bigger. So it's still possible to have the SEND system providing a really, really valuable contribution to children, but also having these huge differences in later life outcomes. And I think that then raised the point about what is the SEND system trying to achieve for children, and that can have lots of different dimensions and outcomes in terms of both time and different sorts of outcomes. So in the immediate outcome, it might be just keeping children safe and being happy during their childhood. It could be about educational outcomes. It could be about later life outcomes. It could be about independence. It could be about health. And we don't really talk about, we don't really talk enough about what the system is trying to achieve in terms of the outcomes, and then how you structure the system to achieve those outcomes. So if we then think about how the current system works, if you think about financial incentives within the system, some of the problems that we observe within the system become a bit more clear where they're coming from. So the way the current, I could spend about an hour talking about how the high needs funding system works. I won't, because I don't have that time, and Josh will definitely glare at me if I do that. So at a high level, mainstream schools are expected to fund the initial costs of education, health and care plans, the first £6,000. They're also expected to fund lower level SEND support. And in a system where needs were relatively stable in 2013 and 2014, that would have worked fine. That would have worked fine. And a lot of the way the funding system in England works is for a stable system. It's not designed for an increase. And however, we have seen a really increasing number of children with education, health and care plans and identified needs, abstracting from where those needs have come from and whether they already existed in the system. We have seen a rise in identified needs. And that has put a real stretch on school resources, because they don't have enough to spend on the increasing numbers of pupils with EHCPs, and that's stretched resources, and that creates a very creates a vicious cycle within the system, because the only way for a school or a parent to be getting additional resources support for the children is to apply for an EHCP. And so that's where all the conflict and focus has been, because that is the only way in the system to guarantee funding and support. However, just because support is written down within an EHCP does not guarantee that support exists within the system, which is kind of the problem, whereby you get this variation in quality. A child in rural Derbyshire, you could write on their EHCP that they require a level 3 teacher assistant with expertise in autism. Doesn't mean they exist, or they can be brought into the school straight away. And that's what I mean about when I said at the start that the problem with the current system is being the lack of focus on supply side capacity and a lack of plan for how to develop the workforce. So if we had gone back, say, even 8 years, and the government had set out, we're going to spend £5 billion extra on special educational needs over the next 8 years. They never did. But if they'd have set that out 8 years ago, so we're going to spend £4 or £5 billion, you would have expected them to come up with a plan for the workforce being able to deliver that system. That never happened. It's been piecemeal by piecemeal, and that's why there's been no improvement in the supply side capacity. So in terms of the government's proposals, this audience is probably quite familiar with it, but I'll give a kind of general overview before then thinking about where we go from here. So the new system from 2029 will try to provide more upstream and flexible support in mainstream schools with a view to try and reducing demand for more specialist support. That's a very noble and general aim. It's obviously more difficult in practice and involves lots and lots of choices. Mainstream schools will be expected to undertake more assessment of needs themselves, which is a big ask and a big change in the role of schools, and to deliver more support packages, which again is a big change in the role of schools and is going to require a long lead time to get it right. And there will be new guidelines whether pupils move to special schools or to mainstream schools. And again, I think, as I said earlier, we don't really have good evidence to set those guidelines, which is kind of the problem where we are in the system at the moment. So we're now really in the phase of transition over the next 3 years, where the current system of EHCPs will remain in place, and the government will provide an extra £3.3 billion in 2028 to cover some of the additional expected costs. But they're also going to be kind of priming the system in terms of providing more upstream support. So that this is the inclusive mainstream fund, the experts at hand service in terms of more educational psychologists, more speech and language therapists. That will be about 1.5 billion per year by 2029. And they're also going to be providing more training for teachers and staff in mainstream schools over the next few years. But that's kind of a small element of what the overall system will look like from 2029. If we go back to the graph at the start and see how that changes the picture. So the little yellow bars here are growth in existing SEND funding, which is confirmed in the white paper. So that kind of adds to what funding is expected for the next 3 years. The government is also providing more mainstream support. That's the experts at hand inclusive mainstream fund, which will be about 1.5 billion by 2028-2029. And then in 2028-29, they're also providing this extra 3.3 billion pounds, and only in 2028-29. I don't know. I don't know why. But they're providing an extra 3 billion, and on paper, that closes that 6 billion expected gap between funding and spending. Whether in reality it closes the gap between demand and funding is a much more difficult question to answer. So the extra 3 billion for EHCP support will be part of closing that gap, and some of the extra 1.2 billion for existing SEND funding will close the gap to some extent. But whether the extra mainstream support closes that demand in abstract sense, it is much harder to answer, because it's creating a different part of the system. It's not really necessarily meeting the demand for EHCPs. It might do. So if you have more speech and language therapists in schools, more educational psychologists, you might reduce the demand for EHCPs because you've met the needs earlier. You might not, because that's a very difficult thing. That's going to be a slow process as well. So question marks there. So there are lots of questions to answer about the new system, but I think the main sticking points in funding are the ones I list here. So firstly, I'm interested in the funding system, because that's kind of the way I work, but that there's going to have to be a new funding system to provide more upfront support. The government has set out that it wants to provide more funding upfront to mainstream schools, as happens in Scotland at the moment. And to do that, they're going to need to have an assessment of what factors are associated with differences in need across schools, and so that they can predict that. Because otherwise you're going to be in a situation where some schools can't meet the needs they face in their school because they haven't got sufficient funding. You need a funding system that can predict need across schools in a good way. You can't do it in a perfect way. And you're always going to need a system that can provide top-up support for pupils with high levels of needs or in very small primary schools, because the financial risk is too great. There are also question marks about the interim incentives, because existing EHCPs will be honoured post 2029 up until the point of transition into different schools. So there's a potential incentive for more EHCPs to be issued over the next 3 years. And councils also know they've been bailed out once, and so that will affect incentives as well. To deliver an effective system, and this is much more about getting the long-run system right, new staff will be required. If you're going to be providing more upfront support in mainstream schools, they will need more staff to deliver that upfront support. So that's going to be about trying to have a workforce plan that sets out the speech therapists, educational psychologists, level 3 teaching assistants that can deliver that mainstream support. Obviously, the the really big question is, will the new system meet children's needs? And that's obviously a very difficult thing to answer. But I think the government can go about trying, the best way the government can go about trying, a researcher would say this, more evidence is needed, but the best way to providing more support within the system will be building the evidence base on what support packages and what forms of support are most suitable for people with different types of needs. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all system, and there will need to be variation. And greater evidence is particularly needed on the sort of nexus between specialist and mainstream schools, about how the system can make that choice effectively, and what are the outcomes to consider to make that choice effectively. So that's where I end. If you have any questions, I'll be very, very keen to take them.